Hello everyone, my name is Crispin, and today I'm going to lay out what I feel is the quintessential case for supporting Ukraine from a realist perspective. Now, it's no secret that at this point in the United States and increasingly across Europe, the populist right is now ascendant. Trump experienced a crushing victory in the US election. In Europe, the populist right is firing all cylinders in Germany, Italy, France, Romania, and potentially the UK also. Meanwhile, the world's richest man, Elon Musk, now controls the most sophisticated political communications platform ever devised, and he is firmly aligned with the nationalist populist movements that are increasing in strength across the Western world. One key tenet of the populist right is that they do not get entangled in foreign wars. Now, before I leap into why Ukraine should be placed in a different category, it's important to give this perspective its due. By any measure, stewardship of US foreign policy over the past 40 years has been utterly catastrophic. The Vietnam War, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Haiti, Somalia, I can go on. Collectively, these have cost the American taxpayer trillions of dollars, tens of thousands of lives, and crippled American prestige. Meanwhile, China has seized islands in the South China Sea, suppressed Hong Kong's democracy, and threatens to invade Taiwan. At the same time, Iran's nuclear program continues apace, and North Korea's is already well established. Indeed, the US would be a lot better off right now if the Washington elite had taken a permanent holiday as soon as the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. In short, Trump voters are right to be skeptical of the US elite. They have been poorly served. It's understandable then that many millions of people in both the US and Europe look at Ukraine as just another distant adventure where the risks are great, interests are marginal, and the cost open-ended. Now, the strongest intellect behind America limiting support for Ukraine is Elbridge Colby, a man whose work I have covered extensively on this channel previously. Colby has just been named Under-Secretary of Defense in the incoming Trump administration, a clear signal on the direction of travel when it comes to American defense policy. Colby is also a staunch realist. Most other foreign policy realists agree that the war in Ukraine is not in America's interest to keep supporting, so as a realist, I am in the minority. Moreover, I tend to disagree with some others who claim to be a realist and support Ukraine. For example, Dr. Niall Ferguson, a man I admire greatly as a historian, has gone around the world drumming up support for Ukraine, which is great, but it also purports to do so from a realist perspective. And yet when I listen to his arguments, they are from quite a different paradigm. And as a result, those arguments are weak. Okay, so what is realism? Why do a majority of realists argue against continuing to support Ukraine with regards to Russia? And why do I think that they have it all wrong and continued Western support for Ukraine is strategically correct? Well, realism is a school of international relations theory that views states as the primary actors in international politics. According to realists, states are driven primarily by the need to ensure their own survival and security in this self-help system. Since states can never be certain of other states' intentions, they seek to maximize their relative power, particularly military and economic capabilities, to protect their interests. The most powerful states shape the international order, while others must carefully balance their interests, capabilities, and geopolitical position to survive in a fundamentally competitive and conflictual system. Realists argue this competitive dynamic emerges from both human nature and the structural pressures of the international anarchy, making conflict and power a permanent feature of international relations. In my view, this structural paradigm, while sometimes incomplete when it comes to individual cases, is still the best for explaining why things happen in global affairs. So why are so many realists against supporting Ukraine? Well, primarily this is because each nation has a hierarchy of interests, and structural instability occurs when these are out of balance between national belligerence. Take the United States, for example. Its primary strategic competitor is China. China, with its 1.4 billion people, is the only country in the world capable of displacing the United States as the world's dominant power. For instance, if China were to expel the United States from Asia, where 2/3 of global growth will occur this century, this will push America into permanent relative decline. This changes the way the whole world works, regarding the laws governing commons to the reserve currency. As the US is pushed to the margins and China expands into the Pacific, the US homeland in the longer term could even be threatened if China comes to dominate the Asian region. Unquestionably, Trump's greatest foreign policy success in his first term of office was to wake up both sides of American politics to the China challenge. And since the Pacific is the most important by far, any other theatre, be it the Middle East or Europe, is of second-tier importance to the United States. Realists don't say that America has no interest in Ukrainian victory. Of course, it's in American interest for Russia's expansionism to be curtailed. It's just that that's at the lower end of strategic priority. Elveridge Colby forcefully argues, for instance, that the ordnance being used in Ukraine obviously can't be used to defend Taiwan, while the focus on land forces for Europe badly distracts from the maritime assets needed for the US-China military balance. Meanwhile, Ukraine, with its centuries-long cultural intercourse with Russia, sharing everything from Rus heritage to Christian orthodoxy, not to mention the linked geography, makes Ukraine of core national security interest to the Russian Federation. Were Ukraine to join NATO, it is argued, the national security threat for Russia would be so untenable that Moscow would be willing to wage a massive war, perhaps even a nuclear war, in order to prevent it. And now that Russia's victory conditions have lessened from its maximalist aims at the start of the war, the overthrow of the Zelensky government and the redrafting of Ukraine's constitution, down to something more modest, the annexation of Russian-speaking areas at the east of the country and Ukrainian defense neutrality, well, many realists argue that continuing to support Ukraine's war effort becomes harmful and a net negative on multiple levels. First, they say that Russia simply won't allow itself to be defeated, given that it'll sacrifice endless amounts of blood and treasure to preserve what it sees as a core national security interest, despite heavy losses. Second, that the ability of Ukrainian forces to make significant further gains is questionable, especially in light of the failed counteroffensive in July of 2023. Third, one previous risk from Russian expansionism, that it would embolden Russia and Putin to perhaps invade the Baltic in the future, they argue is diminished. After all, the accession of Sweden and Finland has turned the entire Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. It also makes any such invasion by Russia of Lithuania or Estonia logistically far more difficult. And increases in defense spending have also strengthened European deterrence, while Russian military setbacks in Ukraine have shattered the Kremlin's delusions of regional dominance. Meanwhile, the costs and risks of continuing to support Ukraine, many realists now argue, is unacceptably high. After all, Russia has by far the largest nuclear weapon stockpile on Earth, and American-made missiles are now hitting targets deep within Russia's own territory. And with Ukraine basically just holding the line, even with the huge amounts of international support being given to it, well, the losses are going to continue to mount with no end in sight. The final argument that many realists make is a grand strategic one, that as Russia should be a natural ally of the West against China. And prior to the war, many realists, myself included, were hopeful of a reverse Nixon. That is, recognizing that Russia is culturally, linguistically, historically a European country, one that, for many Russians, would prefer be part of a victorious West than a permanent China slave in a new coalition. To that end, I agree with many of the criticisms made against America's so-called unipolar moment. Russia was humiliated after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many ways unnecessarily. American triumphalism did contribute to Russian resentment. Now, many of the same things could have been done, certainly securing the future of Poland and the Baltic countries, including through NATO membership, but without an unseemly degree of haughtiness that has long fed Russian anger. So yes, I agree with all of that. So why then do I differ from my fellow realists and say that continued Western support for Ukraine is strategically correct? There are a number of reasons. The first is that while we can lament that Russia has become a Chinese proxy, even blame ourselves to a degree, the fact remains that Russia is a Chinese proxy, and it should be considered in that way as a strategic calculus. Indeed, Moscow is now so enmeshed in China's system that any meaningful disaggregation can be discounted for the foreseeable future. Now, I agree with Bridge Colby that the argument made by some that says, well, we have to continue supporting Ukraine because that will deter China by demonstrating our resolve, that is absurd. However, Western support for Ukraine does deter China, just not for that reason. You see, when China invades Taiwan, it will hope and expect a few other things to happen at the same time to keep Washington off balance. One will be for North Korea to invade South Korea. It will hope Iran attacks Israel with some missiles. And finally, that Russia invades the Baltic countries in NATO. Beijing rightly fears that in a direct head-to-head showdown with Washington that it would likely lose. However, if it can get America overstretched in a land war on the Korean Peninsula, defending NATO in Europe, then achieving China's primary strategic objective, the reunification of Taiwan into the mainland, well, that becomes not only possible, but probable. By continuing to tie Russia down in Ukraine, Washington weakens China's proxy while taking invasion of the Baltic off the table in China's strategic thinking over Taiwan. The second reason is that while yes, Ukraine is strategically more significant for Moscow than Washington, the cost of supporting Ukraine is scaled and commensurate with this fact. As at the end of 2024, the US had committed around $60 billion to Ukraine. That's about 2% of America's total defense spending over that period. And look at what it has got in return for that investment. Massively increased defense spending and cohesion among European allies across the board. Strong and capable nations like Finland joining NATO, and a Chinese proxy being greatly diminished. Even conservative estimates have Russia spending around 3 times the amount that America has in Ukraine, but with 1,000 lives a day as well. Combine this with the unprecedented sanctions leveled against Russia, well, it is spending around $500 million to $1 billion a day to prosecute this war. Given power in international affairs, unlike some other areas, is zero-sum, the relative strength of a country is the net calculus between your own strength and your adversary's weakness. Putting that together, America's investment in Ukraine has proven a massive bargain. Now, it's true that Russia's economy has held up better under Western sanctions than was expected. However, this has been an exercise by the Russian central bank in playing a game of the floor is lava. So far, Russia has treaded water by borrowing against its demographic future, but now the rot is setting in. The ruble is collapsing, inflation is spiraling, and interest rates are at 23%. Things are only going to get worse. So this brings me to the third reason to continue to support Ukraine. Time is firmly on Washington's side. Russia cannot sustain the war indefinitely without seeing its economy crumble, whereas for America, this is just a political problem, not an economic or social stability one. Yes, Ukraine matters more to Moscow and thus can be expected to endure greater cost, but support for Ukraine should continue at least at the current levels while ramping up economic pressure. Russia will then have only 2 choices in the dilemma. It can escalate the war, for which the economic and political risk for the Kremlin will likely prove intolerable, or it can continue to scale back its victory conditions to the point where it's a de facto defeat. And yet another reason to continue supporting Ukraine from a realist point of view is that we are seeing emerge in Europe a new balance of power that is highly favourable to the West, which the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has facilitated. For instance, Poland's status as a military and economic power is rocketing northward, and its own history through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Treaty of Hadiak and others, has a connection to Ukrainian nationhood that directly challenges Moscow's historical claims. This emerging Slav-Nordic realignment in Central and Northern Europe is creating a strong counterballast to Russian expansion, and thus allowing a free Ukraine to join that grouping without actually joining NATO itself will still be a significant check on Russia's regional influence in the longer term. Continuing to support Ukraine in the meantime will help underwrite these trends that have been put into motion. Once this new power center is firmly established, America can potentially withdraw from the region entirely, allowing this new order to take effect, with bandwagoning of countries in the region carrying the security apparatus forward. The bottom line is this: we need to treat the China, Russia, North Korea axis as a single political alignment. That's how they are treating it after all. North Korean soldiers are fighting in Ukraine. Chinese ships are cutting internet cables in the Baltic Sea. When we as realists look at the strategic map through that lens, then abandoning Ukraine or forcing it into negotiation is revealed as a suboptimal decision. This is what I believe to be strategically correct, and I'm happy to discuss this further with anyone at the Pentagon or Brussels. Now, this is also my thank you video for everyone who has joined Baltic World over the last few years. It was my hope that there'd be a way to make this channel self-sustaining as it was in flight, and that my dream and ambition has been to bring the criminally underrated cultural and historical significance of the Baltic region, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, to the wider world. Unfortunately, this channel does need to remain a labour of love for the time being, and as such, we will be repositioning back to dangerous policy as it was originally. So for those that joined from the OG, congratulations, there'll be a much wider range of content. But if you have joined for the Baltic specific material, remember that the Baltic region remains my first love when discussing world affairs, and there'll be plenty of stuff for people who have joined for that content. Anyway, in the meantime, I wish you all well. Please leave your thoughts and comments on this video down below, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.